It's time to get into a little bit of voter registration info, ladies and gentlemen. Now, at the beginning of Kamala Harris's campaign, again, I told you guys that was more the honeymoon period, but she was surging, right? Like they said, oh, look, she's leading in all these swing states, etc. Then after the endorsement from Taylor Swift, there was an increase in Democrat voter registration. In fact, significantly in Pennsylvania, which is, for those who don't know, Pennsylvania is Taylor Swift's home state. That's where she's originally from. Got to remember, people move to Nashville a lot of times. But that was kind of a sign, right? That looked like things were going to be great for Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party. Now, as we get closer to Election Day, things are starting to change. And it's really interesting how the tide is starting to turn. And I think one of the things I want to remind people when we get into Republican voters, it seems like to me that whereas Democrat voters may tend to act a little bit earlier, it seems like conservative voters tend to wait a little bit later. And I think you're going to see that now in this clip here from CNN about the new voter registration. Listen to this, folks.
Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, well, they might as well just assume residency in this Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's attracted the most amount of attention of any of the 50 states, and it could very well determine the next president. And now with the voter registration deadline fast approaching, there are some critical data points to help give us some clues about what might happen in just 3 short weeks. So I have Harry Enton here at the Magic Wall to dive into the numbers. All right, so Harry, tell us what you have found about how voters are leaning at this point compared to 2020.
Yeah, I mean, the voter registration numbers, if you want a stat that Republicans absolutely love, it's this one. All right, Pennsylvania voter registration, you register by party in that state. You go back to November of 2020, you see Democrats 47%, Republicans 39%. That was an 8-point advantage. Look at where we are today. Yes, more voters in Pennsylvania are registered as Democrats than Republicans, but it's now just 44% to 40%. Now they've got a 4-point gap. Republicans, have cut that Democratic advantage in half. In such a short period of time. They have gone out, they have registered voters. There are folks that have come over to their side who were previously registered Democrats. The question is, where are they picking up ground, Manu? Where are they?
Pause here for just a second and let's talk about something. So you guys see what's happening, right? It looks as though the Republican voters waited, whereas a lot of the Democrat voters, or those who were considering supporting the Democratic Party, waiting to see if Biden was going to drop out or whatever, the moment that Kamala Harris was announced, they were like, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and register, Democrat, especially after that endorsement from Taylor Swift as well. But now you're starting to see with the conservative voters, it seems like, again, they tend to wait a little bit later. We are now about 3 weeks away from the presidential election. And now they're starting to see an increase in GOP registration. So we got to ask again, where are those voters coming from? Because I would think a lot of people that were like Trump supporters, they probably already were registered anyway, right? Like these are people that were probably already registered to vote, maybe supported Trump in 2016 and in 2020. But these are people that most likely probably were not registered in 2022 for the midterms and also in 2020. So who could those people be? One possibility is it could be some of those Nikki Haley voters, people who supported her during the GOP primary, but maybe they weren't registered through the Republican Party. It could be them. It could be some independents. And I think that's going to be something that really decides this presidential race. It's going to be the independent voters, right? Let's go ahead and dive back in.
Picking up ground. This to me says it all. All right. Which Pennsylvania counties did the GOP gain in registration? If you look in the counties where less than 50% of the population is non-college white voters, Republicans gain just a point. Where you have over 50% non-college whites, look at this. Republicans gain 6 points on average.
Wow.
They are picking up ground in the areas you would expect them to pick up ground.
So once again, we're seeing that Republicans are picking up, again, the non-college white voters. This also speaks to, some of the blue collar workers as well, tend to be leaning more towards the Republican Party.
Right, those non-college white dominated areas, coal country in the Northeast, Southwest, outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But the bottom line is the registration trends, the trends we've been seeing the last few cycles with Republicans dominating among non-college white voters, very much showing up in this party registration.
It's so interesting because David McCormick, who's the Senate candidate, the Republican Senate candidate, told me actually he believes that can actually propel him to victory because they're narrowing that margin with Democrats of voter registration. But what does this mean for Kamala Harris and her chances of victory in Pennsylvania?
All right, so all of this data, bad news for Democrats, right? Good news for Republicans. But there's one thing to keep in mind, right? You had that New York Times Siena College poll that came out yesterday that showed Kamala Harris slightly ahead, but within the margin of error. Why is that? Because take a look here. This is the Pennsylvania margin by party registration in that poll. What you see here is that Kamala Harris, I'm going to come over to your side of the screen, Manu, is doing better among Democrats, a 77-point lead, than Donald Trump is among Republicans, a 74-point advantage. She's also doing better with those who are not registered with a party or with another party. But this nugget is key because even though Republicans have closed that registration gap, they haven't closed it completely. So the fact that Harris is doing slightly better among Democrats and Republicans, and there are more of them, that is what gives Democrats solace, is because at this particular point, that state, compared to, say, Arizona, slightly more favorable to Kamala Harris.
So I want to jump in here for just a second, and I want to say something as well. So what I think is happening is I think some of the people that are coming out to support Kamala Harris, and by the way, some people have already voted. I've already noticed this. But some of the people that are coming out to support Kamala Harris, they're probably from that Philadelphia and Pittsburgh area, right? So those areas tend to be more blue. It's similar like this in Massachusetts too. Like the cities tend to be more blue, and as you get out into the rural areas, they tend to be a little bit more red. With the exception of the Berkshires, they usually do tend to be blue. But I'm guessing that some of the people where the Republican Party may be closing that gap is with some of those rural voters that maybe did not come out and vote for Donald Trump in 2020. So maybe it's those people. I'm wondering if some of those people that they're gaining are people that may have supported Joe Biden in 2020, but now are supporting Donald Trump. Remember what they're saying in the story here. And this is what we always got to remember. What is the message in the story? Is that Republican voter registration is increasing, particularly in Pennsylvania. They are starting to close that gap between the Democratic Party. So that would tell me these are either independent voters that maybe are registering Republican, or it could be people, and Democratic Party may not want to hear this, but it could be some of the people that voted for Biden in 2020 and now are flipping to vote for Donald Trump. And I've seen this happen before. Remember, there were people that voted for Obama that switched and voted for Donald Trump. There were people that voted for Trump in 2016 and voted for Biden in 2020. In fact, I know one person personally who did that. So we're having like a lot of like movement that's happening, particularly there in Pennsylvania. But he's going to get into some of the other states, too, that I want you to see.
At least in the polling data so far.
So what does this tell us? I mean, are we seeing this nationally? Are we seeing this in other battleground states, this change in the registration advantage Democrats?
Yeah, all right. So this, if it was just Pennsylvania and we're seeing just one state, I don't think we'd necessarily be doing this segment. But I believe it is part of a larger picture. Fewer voters who are registered as Democrats. This is across the battleground states where you have party registration. Not every state has party registration, right? Wisconsin doesn't, Georgia doesn't, Michigan doesn't. But in the battleground states where, in fact, you do have party registration, there are now fewer registered Democrats in Arizona, fewer registered Democrats in Nevada, fewer registered Democrats, and, of course, the great state of North Carolina.
Okay, that could be a problem for Kamala Harris's campaign. This is the exact opposite of what we were seeing when Kamala Harris announced. This is the opposite. She was doing pretty well in those states. And now we're starting to see that voter registration for the Democratic Party is down in those swing states. I'll tell you something else in a minute. We'll come back.
So what we're seeing in Pennsylvania is being seen in other states as well. More folks are registering as Republicans as compared to Democrats. But we're looking at the battleground states. Let's take this out nationally, all right? This is party registration, but let's look at party identification. Party registration, of course, is you're actually registered with a party. Party ID is when you say, I feel like a Democrat today, I feel like a Republican today. They're correlated, but they're not exactly the same. But I think it gets at the trend that's going on here, Manu. All right, so party ID nationally. You go to October, November of 2016, Democrats had a 3-point advantage. You go 4 years ago, Democrats had a 6-point advantage. Look at where we are today, Manu. Republicans with a 1-point advantage. A very different picture, very much mirroring what we see in the party registration numbers in those key battleground states and Pennsylvania in particular.
This is very telling, you guys. This is very telling. Again, as I've said before, and I don't know how you guys feel about this, but it does seem like to me that Democrats tend to, when it comes to presidential election, it seems like Democrat voters tend to act early and Republican voters tend to act a little bit later. And so this is why I was saying, like, when Kamala Harris was having like her honeymoon period, this is why I was telling people, like, you guys, like, you should probably wait until we get closer to the election, because that happens for a lot of candidates. Like, they announce and then like they have this wave of like energy and everybody's hype and excited about them. And then as we get closer to the election day, you see things start to change. Now, I want to show you something else that I think people should see. This is important as well. Shout out to Simon Ataba for this clip. NBC's Murray says Harris is losing a 5-point lead, Listen to this. Now, this is MSNBC, so 2 different networks.
We had, of course, Joe Biden in the race, losing ground to Donald Trump. Kamala Harris gets in the race. It seems to be tied up. You have a debate. Harris gets the bump from the debate, goes up 4 or 5 points, and then it comes back where you knew it was going to come back to. We're 3 weeks out. We're tied. It's 48-48. And there's some really interesting numbers I want to ask you about, and mainly about Kamala Harris needing to lock down a higher percentage of Hispanic voters, needing to lock down a higher number of black voters, and also, of course, carrying on the other side of the margin, carrying a historic number of white educated voters. And it's just fascinating to see how all that's going to play together. Tell us what you got.
Yeah, and Joe, you're exactly right. The timing of our poll is really instructive here. And when our September poll came out and had Harris with a 5-point lead over Donald Trump, that, of course, was after the debate. It was after a really rough news environment for Donald Trump with the discussion about Springfield, Ohio. And now all of a sudden we do show a tied race. And what has occurred is that those soft Republicans, non-MAGA Republicans, have come back home to Trump.
Okay. So do you see what's happening, ladies and gentlemen? So he said the soft MAGA, he said the soft MAGA Republicans have come back home to Donald Trump. Kamala Harris was ahead 5 points, by 5 points ahead of Donald Trump. And now he's saying that it is tied. So that means that some of those, I would say some of maybe the Nikki Haley supporters in the Republican primary, or maybe even some of those Ron DeSantis supporters, I'm not really sure, but it seems like it might be more the Nikki Haley people are starting to come back around and say, okay, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead. I wanted Nikki Haley or I wanted, Ron DeSantis, but I think, instead of sitting this one out, I think I'm going to go ahead and support Donald Trump. So what that shows you is that it seems like with the Republican Party, in particular with the Republican voters, they seem to come back around in the end. Now, there may be some of them still, and nobody is really mentioning this anymore, but the reality is RFK Jr. is still on the ballot in some of those swing states, by the way. And there are still some people that are going to vote for RFK Jr., even though he, sort of suspended his campaign and got on board with Donald Trump and said, we're trying to do this, yada, yada. But this is another thing. And I think this is where the Democratic Party could be underestimating, because there's a lot of focus on Jill Stein, et cetera. But I think they could be underestimating the fact that there were some people who may have been maybe open to the Democratic Party or were Democrats or whatever that are supporting RFK Jr. All of RFK Jr.'s support didn't come from Donald Trump. I would say most of it was, but not all of it. So just keep that in mind. He is still on the ballot in the swing states. All right, finish up here.
In our September poll, they were lagging, obviously, after the debate, after the discussion of Springfield, Ohio. Our poll finds them that they are back with Trump, and that explains him going from 44% in our poll in September now to 48%. But, Joe, you ended up mentioning the things that Harris has to work on with shoring up Latino voters, getting African Americans in the fold, white women. Our poll ends up having a really big gender gap where Harris has a 14-point lead among female voters, while Donald Trump has a 16-point lead among male voters. That's overall a 30-point net gender gap. And what is kind of fascinating is that Trump's lead with men is slightly larger than Harris's lead with women. And if her ability to get back in a lead, national lead over Trump is being able to have a bigger lead among women than Trump's lead among men. And so a lot of those demographics, this is the last 3 weeks of the race. This is why you end up having mobilization and campaign to be able to juice your turnout, to shore up your weaknesses. And we're going to see what both campaigns have up their sleeves over the next 3 weeks.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, this explains also why Kamala Harris's campaign may be freaking out a little bit, or why the Democratic Party may be freaking out a little bit. Obviously, there is they call it the threat of Jill Stein. So obviously they are going to be worried about that. But at the same time, the reality is the fact that she has lost that 5-point lead, that is very telling. And I remember a couple of weeks ago, there were some commentators, corporate media commentators, that said that, it didn't look like that needle was going to move at all. I think they spoke too soon. Things change as you get closer to the election day.